Showing off, don't wanna have to wait tonight. Wait tonight, better off. I'm gonna find my way tonight. Wait tonight, won't you talk to me? I wanna heal your sorrow. Won't you talk to me? We'll make a new tomorrow. Won't you talk to me? Showing off, don't wanna have to wait tonight. Wait tonight, better off. I'm gonna find my way tonight. Wait tonight, won't you talk to me? I wanna heal your sorrow. Won't you talk to me? We'll make a new tomorrow. Won't you talk to me?
All right. Hello, everyone. Oh, where are my captions again? Well, heck. Can I get them to come back up? Yeah. All right. Nope. Looks like my link died again, so bear with me. Fix it real quick. No worries. Okay, that should fix it. I think. We'll try it. All right. So, okay, so we are on chapter 3 of Problem of Slavery in Western Culture, um, which someone asked me today, oh, did you start reading that because of Juneteenth? No, I did not. It just so happens that this is what was voted on, and I was ready to start a new book. That I started it near Juneteenth is just pure coincidence. It was definitely not any kind of plan. Honestly, I forgot Juneteenth even existed until it came up again. So, here we go. Chapter 3 Slavery and Sin, the Ancient Legacy. The inherent contradiction of slavery lay not in its cruelty or economic exploitation, but in the underlying conception of man as a conveyable possession with no more autonomy of will and consciousness than a domestic animal. This conception raised a host of problems and was seldom acted upon without compromise. Occasionally, men recognized that the institution was dangerous to the security of the state, that it provided some masters with too much idleness and too much power, that slaves were men and should be treated with consideration, but from the ancient world we find no assertion that slavery was an intolerable evil that should be eradicated by any civilized nation. However, nowhere in the religious literature of the Sumero-Akkadian worlds, says Isaac Mendelssohn, was the slightest protest made against slavery. Quote, nor is there anywhere an expression of the mildest sympathy for the victims of this system. Slavery was simply taken for granted. End quote. Noting that no ancient author wrote specifically on slavery, William Westermann concludes that it was never a quote-unquote problem in antiquity. He rejects as sentimental the traditional belief that Greek writers accepted slavery as a necessity but regarded it with uneasiness. With this judgment, Moses Finley completely agrees. Quote, the Greek world was one of endless debate and challenge. Among the intellectuals, no belief or idea was self-evident. Every conception and every institution sooner or later came under attack. Religious beliefs, ethical values, political systems, aspects of the economy, even such bedrock institutions as the family and private property. Slavery, too, up to a point, but that point was invariably a good distance short of abolitionist proposals. End quote. Even in times of rebellion and social upheaval, slavery went unchallenged. But this does not mean that the Bible and classical literature had no bearing on the later anti-slavery movements. From the earliest times, slavery was taken as a model for certain religious, philosophic, and political dualisms, and was thus implicitly connected with some of the greatest problems in the history of human thought. As a result of these associations and precedents embodied in Holy Scripture, in the works of philosophers and divines, in the corpora of Jewish and Roman law, any future attack on slavery would be bound to produce reverberations through the vast range of Western culture. Slavery could never be isolated as an objective issue of public policy. The Hebrew word for slave, ebed, was used in one sense to refer to a righteous punishment sanctioned by the Lord, quote, cursed be Canaan, cried Noah, a servant of servants shall he be unto his brethren, end quote. The phrase a servant of servants, we are told, meant the meanest slave, and the descendants of Canaan, I've never known how to pronounce that with the two A's, Canaan, Canaan. I've never known how that's, I'm sure I've heard it pronounced, but it never has stuck in my head. Anyway, and the descendants of Canaan were thus condemned to perpetual bondage. Solomon was authorized to raise an annual levy of slaves from among the Canaanites. So I guess it's Canaan, because that's Canaanites, not killed in battle. And after the destruction of Babylon by Yahweh, the former oppressors of Israel were to become their slaves. But slavery was also the clearest example of the total subordination of one individual to another, of the negation of personal choice and desire. It was associated in the Old Testament with religious humility and self-surrender, as when Abraham, Lot, Moses, Job, and David were referred to as slaves of the Lord. The Hebrews were perhaps the first people to think of God as a noble master who might be persuaded to give aid and guidance to his lowliest slave. Moses used the same word to refer both to Israel's slavery in Egypt and after deliverance to their bondage to Yahweh. But this new relationship was based on a voluntary covenant in which both parties pledged to abide by their word. In Isaiah, Israel's new master explicitly acknowledged his children as abadim and promised them his protection. Moses repeatedly reminded his people of their former slavery and their new obligations. Quote, and thou shalt remember that thou wast a servant in the land of Egypt. End quote. Thus, liberation and purposeful mission were conceived as a transfer of dependence from arbitrary worldly masters to the Lord, who gave assurance of future peace and plenty in return for faith. The promise of God revealing himself to mankind through a chosen people was associated with emancipation from physical slavery and the voluntary acceptance of a higher form of service. These religious connotations of slavery had profound consequences. On Sinai, Moses was told that the Hebrews should buy their slaves from neighboring nations, and moreover, of the children of the strangers that sojourn among you, of them shall ye buy. What the, it, okay. And of their families that are with you, which they have begotten in your. When did it start a. It started a quote, but it didn't. On Sinai, Moses was told that the Hebrews should buy their slaves from their from neighboring nations, and I guess this is where the quote starts, but it doesn't really indicate that. Moreover, of the children of the strangers that sojourn among you, of them shall you buy, and of their families that are with you, which they have begotten in your land, and they shall be your possession, and ye shall make them an inheritance for your children after you, to hold for a possession. Of them shall ye take your bondmen forever, but over your brethren, the children of Israel, ye shall not rule over one over another with rigor. End quote. Yeah, it was a rough transition there. Sorry. As Josephus later noted, explaining Jewish history to the Hellenistic world, it was not reasonable for Hebrews to make slaves from their own people when God had made so many nations subject to Israel. The careful regulations concerning Jewish servants were justified by the memory of bondage in Egypt, by the recognition of a common dependence on Yahweh the Emancipator. Thus, no Hebrew bondsman was to serve without his consent for longer than 50 years. Severe punishment awaited the Jew who stole and sold one of his brethren, and Moses received detailed provisions for the redemption of indignant Jews bought by resident aliens. But while Jeremiah condemned his people for re-enslaving Hebrew bondsmen who had been released from service, and while Job tried to prove his righteousness by acknowledging that God would have had reason to punish him if he had despised the cause of his servants, the Old Testament contains no explicit protest against slavery. Of greater significance for the future, however, was the association of religious mission with liberation from bondage to men and with a new bondage to a higher authority. This central conception would ultimately have special meaning for American colonists who thought of their own mission as a deliverance from spiritual slavery in Europe and as adherence to divine law in a New Jerusalem. The claim has often been made that Plato was at heart an opponent of slavery. This is not the slightest there is not the slightest evidence, however, that he found human bondage contrary to the highest God, or that he intended to exclude it from his ideal republic. He wished, it is true, to discontinue the enslavement of Hellenes, but the servitude of foreigners he took for granted. In his laws, the departures from Athenian practice were all in the direction of increasing the authority of masters and of widening the distinction between slaves and freemen. His prohibition on bondage as a punishment for citizens implied that slavery would be confined to men of foreign stock. Their permanent inferiority was ensured by making the status of slavery inheritable from a parent of either sex. Even the manumitted slave was obliged to serve his former master, and there were no legal safeguards to prevent his being reduced again to slavery. The freedman had no hope of rising to the rank of citizen, for he was required to leave the state after a limited term of residence. Although slaves were to serve the government as informers, they were otherwise subjected to the full authority of their masters, and had no protection against harsh treatment. Plato would even deny them friendly intimacy with the master class, and would give any free person the right to judge and punish a slave for certain crimes, or to take summary vengeance against insult. No American slave code was so severe. Plato's view of slavery was related to his general philosophy in certain ways that were of importance for the future. By the 5th century BC, many Greeks had come to believe that the inferiority of barbarians could be seen in their willingness to submit to despotic and absolutist rulers. According to Herodotus, when two brave Spartans were told by a Persian commander that they might expect great rewards if they submitted to Xerxes, they said in defiance, quote, "A slave's life you understand, but never having tasted liberty, you cannot tell whether it be sweet or no." End quote. For certain Greek writers, including Plato, two consequences followed from this popular distinction between Hellene and barbarian. First, bondage was closely associated with tyrannical government and arbitrary power. A people with a capacity and ardent desire for freedom, as evidenced by their political institutions, could not legitimately be slaves. Second, a Slavish people, quote unquote, lacked the capacity not only for self-government but also for the higher pursuits of virtue and culture. Thus, for Plato, a slave might hold a true belief but could never know the truth of his belief, since he was inherently deficient in reason. While Plato thought that a similar deficiency was shared by many free subjects, and would have allowed certain barbarians an opportunity to acquire civic virtues, he nevertheless supplied the elements for a theory of intellectual inferiority as the natural basis for slavery. He also saw the relation of slave to master as a kind of microcosm of the hierarchical pattern that pervaded society and the entire universe. This is not to say that Plato derived his cosmology or political theory from the model of slavery, yet his reference to the body as the slave of the soul, as Gregory Vlastos has pointed out, was meant as a serious philosophic truth. The relations of body and soul, of sovereign and subjects, of master and slave, Plato subsumed under a single theory of authority and obedience. Moreover, in his cosmology, he perceived a similar dualism of primary cause, which was intelligent and divine, and mechanical or slave cause, which was irrational, disorderly, and lacking in both freedom and conscious purpose. Like a wise master, the demiurge guided the Ananke of the material universe toward the good. It is of the Wow. It is of the utmost significance that Plato associated slavery with both the unruly multitude and the chaotic material world devoid of logos. In effect, he rationalized the contradiction of slavery within a vast cosmic scheme in which irrational nature was ordered and controlled by a divine intelligent authority. Future apologists for slavery were perhaps indebted to Plato for linking the authority of masters to the cosmic principle of order. On the other hand, when we recall that the Abbé Raynal pictured a slave revolt as nature vindicating herself against the perversions of society, it is clear that the terms of the dualism could be reversed when quote unquote nature acquired new meanings. In one sense, Plato's doctrine of ideas was a source for future social criticism, since it implied that the imperfections of this world could be judged in the light of eternal ideals of perfection. This potentiality was largely nullified, however, by what author Arthur Lovejoy has termed the principle of plenitude. Plenitude, sorry. If God's goodness depended on his unlimited fecundity and the completeness of his creation, when the world was a full replica of the realm of ideas or essences, every link in the great chain of being had a valid and necessary function. With Plato's followers, particularly Plotinus, this best of all possible worlds, emanating as a complete and unbroken chain from the Divine One, was thought to contain all possible degrees of evil. Evil, which was simply the privation of some good, had a sufficient reason for existence and could not be eliminated without destroying the beauty and balance of the whole. While few thinkers accepted this principle of plenitude in its extreme form, which could easily become a kind of pantheism, it was to exercise an enormous influence on Western thought. Thus, slavery could be seen not only as exemplifying a cosmic principle of authority and subordination, but as having a necessary place in the ordered structure of being. Like other contradictions, it could be absorbed in higher unities. According to Plato, Aristotle noted the same principle governed the rule of slaves of a household or of a nation. Yet, quote, others affirm that the rule of a master over slaves is contrary to nature, and that the distinction between slaves and free man exists by law only, and not by nature, and being an interference with nature is therefore unjust, end quote. This is the first definite indication that some philosophers had taken the momentous step of associating the contradiction of slavery with the dualism of nature and conventional society, rather than with that of rational order and brute chaos. Aristotle felt the force of this argument, but like Plato, he wished to rationalize slavery by showing its relation to the structure and purposes of being. It had emerged, he thought, from the primitive household or oikia, and was as natural as other relationships of superior and inferior, such as soul and body, man and wife, or father and child. By considering slavery as an essentially domestic relationship, Aristotle endowed it with the sanction of paternal authority and helped to establish a precedent that would govern discussions of political philosophers as late as the 18th century. On one crucial point, however, he disagreed with Plato. Each type of rule had its own characteristics, and one could not say that the master's government of his slaves was the same as the constitutional government of subjects who by nature were free. In fact, if a free people were subjected to the absolute rule of a sovereign who was responsible to no one but himself, they would be the victims of tyranny and would have reason to be the enemies of their government. By drawing this distinction between the authority of masters and the authority of constitutional rulers, Aristotle narrowed the ground on which slavery could be justified. Unlike certain sophists, he could not simply say that all authority rests on force, which is its own justification. He was certain that slavery had a rational basis that differentiated it from tyranny. Yet the Greeks had long used the term slavery to describe the tyrannical governments of their neighbors, and a desire for political liberty might easily develop into a hostility to slavery in any form. To reinforce the separation of political freedom and domestic servitude, Aristotle built his entire argument around Plato's theory of natural inferiority. Later, apologists for slavery would adopt a similar strategy to meet a similar problem. Hey, Nambro, how's it going? Sorry, I just noticed you came in. Um, Hope you're having a good night. Aristotle was obviously attracted by the idea of social relationship founded on natural differences analogous to the subordination of body to soul or of animals to men. Without forced labor, there might have been no polis, and hence no basis for virtue and wisdom. Living in a society that increasingly dissociated culture and public service from the slightest taint of manual labor, he saw slavery as a necessary means of supplying the wants of life. In an apparent admission seized upon by 19th century reformers, he said that if the shuttle would weave and the plectrum touch the lyre without a hand to guide them, quote, chief workmen would not want servants, nor masters slaves, end quote. We may doubt, however, whether he yearned for the Industrial Revolution. The illustration was meant to show the complex nature of the slave as both an instrument of action and a conscious agent who must obey and anticipate his master's will. This ambiguous conception raised many problems and did little more than magnify the basic contradiction of human bondage. For Aristotle, true slavery derived from an innate deficiency in the beauty and inner virtue of the soul. Quote, from the hour of their birth, he wrote, some are marked out for subjection, others for rule, end quote. The natural slave lacked the moral and intellectual freedom to make decisions in the light of deliberative judgment. But just as later Calvinists were to deny that the sinner was capable of righteous action, and yet allow that certain restraining graces enabled him to approximate virtue, so Aristotle admitted that the slave had a partial soul and might at least participate in reason. The bondsman was even capable of a lower form of moral virtue which arose from the proper fulfillment of his function. Aristotle had no sympathy with Plato's view that masters should only command their slaves and never converse with them in a friendly manner. The relationship was clearly one of mutual benefit, and yet true friendship was impossible, for the slave was incapable of reciprocating genuine goodwill or benevolence. His true interests could never be other than those of his master. Indeed, one could scarcely speak of his having interests, since as a tool or possession he was only an extension of his master's physical nature. The best slave, it would appear, was the one whose humanity had been most nearly effaced. The difficulties raised ooh, that came quick. The difficulties raised by this conception, even in the Hellenic world, can be illustrated by several passages from the plays of Euripides, which were written in the previous century. In Helen, a slave finds his moral freedom and human identity precisely where Aristotle would obliterate them. Sympathizing with his master's joys and sorrows, this bondsman says that he would not want to suffer the two evils of physical slavery and a corrupt heart. Thus, even a born slave could assert his inner freedom by identifying himself with his master. And while Euripides raised no protest against the injustice of slavery, he sensed that its origins were filled with dramatic pathos. Any Greek could admire the spirit of Polysena, Polysena, sister of Hector, who was marked, as she said, to be a bride for kings, and who preferred death to degrading slavery. She and Andromache, I'm not familiar with that name, sorry, were shadowy prototypes of the royal African slaves of 18th century verse and drama. It is clear that even Aristotle was bothered by the origin of slavery and by the messiness and ambiguity of social as opposed to natural distinctions. The natural slave, having no deliberative faculty, could not be happy with freedom, but obviously some men who by nature were free and virtuous had been enslaved as a result of war. Aristotle acknowledged that such slaves, held by force and mere social convention, could have no common interest with their masters. Presumably, the authority of their masters was no more legitimate than that of political tyrants, though he was confident that nature would like to make sharp distinctions in the bodies of men, equipping some for a docile acceptance of hard labor, others for politics and the arts of war and peace. He admitted that physical differences were no clear indication of natural status. This admission opened a significant gap between the actual and theoretical slave, a gap that would be widened by Stoics and Christians and not fully closed until later generations invented the theory of racial inferiority. The difficulty of detecting natural slaves might have led Aristotle to conclude, as did the later Stoics, that external distinctions were of no meaning. But his philosophy presupposed a close harmony between nature and society. Since Hellenes found it unnatural to use the term doulos for a man of their own race, and generally reserved the word for a barbarian, this must reveal an awareness of innate differences. It would be best, Aristotle said, if the Greeks acquired their agricultural slaves from a different race, a race lacking the Hellenic spirit of liberty. In various ways, he expressed his desire for a neater separation between slaves and free men. He objected to citizens who practiced the crafts of their inferiors, since this would eventually tend to eliminate the distinctions between slaves and free men. It was dangerous, he said, for children to be much in the company of slaves. Like Plato, Aristotle associated slavery with an ideal of intelligent and virtuous authority ruling the irrational forces of the world. Apparently, troubled by possible injustices in the way slaves were acquired, he searched for an answer in the assumed inferiority of barbarians, and while he favored increasing the division between slaves and freemen, he said at one point that he would explain why it was expedient to hold out liberty as an ultimate reward for service. This promise he failed to keep, except perhaps in the example of emancipating his own slaves. We do not know the names of Aristotle's opponents who believed that slavery was a violation of nature. Along with the Hebrew concept of deliverance, the doctrine was one of the cultural sources of anti-slavery thought, though this potentiality was limited by the fact that it was the product of a developing trend in philosophy which exhibited a profound indifference to worldly problems. Only fragments survive from the writings of Cynics and early Stoics, whose influence for some 5 centuries was nevertheless greater than that of the Peripatetics. We know that instead of rationalizing the diverse elements of society into a coherent system in which such institutions as slavery were securely connected to natural principles or to an ideal realm of essences, they perceived an immense gap between objective truth and human conventions. Virtue they conceived as action in accord with nature as revealed to man through uncorrupted reason. This meant that instead of subordinating himself to an ordered system of social relationships, the individual must liberate himself from the constraint of both institutions and the ideology supporting them. He would work out the meaning of truth only in independent and practical conduct, while such a quest for individual freedom could easily lead to a challenge of accepted norms and institutions. The dissident philosophers were largely unconcerned with questions of social justice. Their brave skepticism arose from a desire for truth and inner purity. The sophists were apparently the first to conclude that since slavery was a product of human convention, it had no basis in the objective and unchanging law of nature. Al Alcidamas, when defending the emancipation of the Messenians by the Thebans, argued that the distinction of slave and free man was unknown to nature. It is impossible to tell how far he would have carried the point. Antisthenes, who was this crucial link between Socrates and the Stoics, was said to have written a treatise, quote, of freedom and slavery. And it's just the title, sorry, which may have been a source of later Stoic doctrine. Believing that virtue was a matter of individual commitment and independence, this founder of the Cynic school also strove to shock public opinion in a way that anticipated later reformers. He not only set himself off with a beard and peculiar garb, but attacked the state, marriage, and private property. The emblem of the Cynics, who bore a certain resemblance to the Bohemians and beatniks of later ages, was the dog. The pattern of demonstrative contempt for accepted values was most pronounced in Antisthenes' famous pupil Diogenes of Sinope. Striving for a life of perfect simplicity, he lived in a tub, walked barefoot in snow, and threw his cup away in shame after seeing a child drink from its hands. Though he favored abolishing marriage and holding wives in common, there is no report of his having denounced slavery. Yet a defiant disregard for the conventional distinctions between slave and free man was part of his quest for virtue as an inner freedom and, and independence. Quote, "It would be absurd," he said when his own slave had run away, "if Manes can live without Diogenes, but Diogenes cannot get on without Manes." End quote. When he was captured by pirates on a voyage to Aegina and taken to a slave market in Crete, he pointed to a spectacular wearing I'm sorry, a spectator wearing purple robes and said, quote, "Sell me to this man, he needs a master," end quote. He called the friends who wished to redeem him simpletons. Lions, he said, were not the slaves of those who fed them. Quote, "For fear is the mark of the slave, whereas wild beasts make men afraid of them." End quote. Whether these tales are true, they illustrate a pattern of thought that gave rise to the first explicit questioning of slavery. For if freedom is conceived as a liberation of the individual from the norms and institutions of society, as well as from the desires of the flesh, external distinctions lose all importance. According to Bion, I guess that's how you pronounce it, Bion, I'll say Bion, a pupil of Crates, crates. um, Good slaves are free, but evil men are slaves, desiring many things. But we must not read too much into these isolated statements. Zeno, who was also a pupil of Crates, is supposed to have said that it was as great a crime to strike a slave as to strike one's father. Yet Diogenes Laertius tells us that when Zeno was chastising a slave who said that it was his fate to steal, the philosopher replied, quote, "Yes, and to be beaten too." End quote. It has been claimed that Onesicritus, a Cynic philosopher and pupil of Diogenes of Sinope, advocated the abolition of slavery. He has even been called a forerunner of William Lloyd Garrison. Onesicritus was sent to India by Alexander, and his account of his travels was one of the first combinations of historical narrative and utopian fantasy. The land of Musicanus he described as a kind of ideal society in which the people refrained from the use of gold and silver and ate publicly at a common mess. One might assume that a Cynic philosopher would exclude slavery from such a primitivistic utopia, yet the passage in Strabo, which has been taken as evidence of Onesicritus's hostility to slavery, has precisely the opposing meaning. Quote, "But although Megasthenes says that no Indian uses slaves, Onesicritus declares that slavery is peculiar to the Indians in the country of Musicanus, and tells that what a success it is there, just as he mentions many other successes of this country, speaking of it as a country excellently governed, end quote. Whereas Aristotle held that a slave was actually part of his master's physical being, Zeno and Chrysippus saw his soul as part of the total substance of a universal reason. External distinctions between Greek and barbarian, male and female, or slave and free man were thus mere accidents that had no relevance to nature. True virtue which could be achieved only by living in accordance with principles revealed by a common and universal reason, had nothing to do with conventional standards of morality. But as these early Stoics attempted to work out the practical meaning of virtue, they qualified their belief in the universal brotherhood of man with the principle that the majority of men were slaves to desire and prejudice. Only the philosopher who achieved the power of independent action in the cold light of reason could be termed truly free. There is a rough analogy between the Stoic and Hebrew conceptions of liberation from human authorities and conformity to the laws of a higher power. From both points of view, true freedom was a privilege to be enjoyed by an elite group, and there could be no graduations of relative improvement between the slavish multitude and the children of virtue. The Stoics' ethical world was one of stark antithesis. All sins were equally sinful, and from moral slavery there could be no gradual emancipation. And while the Stoics measured the evils of society against the absolute standard of nature, and held that the philosopher saint must persevere in exercising his virtue, they found no difficulty in accepting as inevitable the many imperfections of the world. The wise man's virtue lay not in good works, but in decisions that revealed an inner purity and self-control. Since the world had fallen irretrievably from a former golden age, he could not regard poverty, disgrace, slavery, or even death as evils in themselves, any more than he could consider their opposites as intrinsic goods. The only thing that mattered was the way one responded to the vicissitudes of fortune. True freedom meant self-transcendence, a disengagement of the ego from one's surroundings, and thus the environment of the slave was no more dangerous than any other to the well-being of the soul. It might indeed afford greater security against distracting stimuli. Epictetus Epictetus, who had been a slave himself in his early life, used the bondsman's desire for immediate liberty as an example of the illusions of worldly expectations. After describing the plight of the hungry, homeless freedman, Epictetus observed that even if the ex-slave should ultimately enjoy material success, he would have no knowledge of virtue and would only become a slave to love, to desire, or to political faction. The philosopher pictured the disenchanted freedman looking back with nostalgia to a time when his physical needs were limited and cared for by a master. But the Stoics' indifference to society and history should not blind us to the fact that they associated slavery with the imperfections of the world and sin with a special kind of slavery. These associations would have a different meaning if combined with the belief that a particular place or a particular time was marked for the redemption of humanity. Even in the Roman world of the 1st and 2nd centuries AD, the Stoic doctrines led to what Westerman has aptly termed a quote-unquote frigid sympathy for the slave. Though Cicero believed that subjection was beneficial for some men, he saw slavery as a result of greed and ignorance. Plutarch and Juvenal sharply criticized the cruelty of certain masters. Epictetus suggested that slaveholders could not attain true freedom and virtue, since the owner of a slave could not help but become a slave himself, and Seneca developed the theory that only the body of the slave was at the mercy of his master, for, quote, that inner part cannot be delivered into bondage, end quote. Because the slave's soul was untouched by his condition, he had the capacity to do more for his master than required. Such beneficence service might provide the basis for a relationship transcending external condition. The same idea had been rejected by Aristotle, but affirmed long before by Euripides. For Seneca, it was essential that masters treat their slaves as they would be treated by their own superiors. Quote, they are slaves, people declare. Nay, rather they are men. Slaves, no, they are our fellow slaves. If one reflects that fortune has equal rights over slaves and freemen alike, end quote. That um, the that part there, because the slave's soul was untouched by his condition, um, for some reason that makes me think of the Robin Williams movie, Being Human. In one part of it, he is a slave, and though he's treated like a slave, he's also kind of the one taking the lead because he's got such an inept and stupid master. Anyway, it just, I don't know, it just reminded me of that particular scene in that movie. Seneca's eloquent defense of the freedom of the slave's soul has often been contrasted with Aristotle's doctrine of total inferiority. The difference, while significant, can easily be exaggerated. Aristotle had admitted that some slaves had the souls of free men, though of course he had assumed a closer correspondence between inner slavishness and external condition than did Seneca. Yet Seneca had no doubt that some men, as a result of sin and corruption, had the souls of slaves. Moreover, he was far more concerned with the pride of masters than with the suffering of slaves. He associated the maltreatment of bondsmen with luxury, arrogance, and gluttony. Discussion of slavery was thus a vehicle for preaching simplicity and humility, and for reminding the well-to-do of how much they owed to fortune. When Seneca wanted to give evidence of his own simplicity of life, he told of taking only a few personal slaves as on one of his trips. The Stoics of the Hellenistic age developed a theory of language that derived from both the Greek tradition of rational analysis and the allegorization of the poets. Essentially, they came to believe that by truly understanding a name, apart from the accidents of convention, they could understand the nature of the thing named. The theory led Hellenistic Jews, especially Philo of Alexandria, to an allegorical interpretation of the Pentateuch. Later on, Irenaeus of Lyons searched in the Old Testament for prefigurations of a universal salvation through the divine Logos. Because of their sins, he concluded that the Jews had had to pass through slavery in Egypt and a subordination to Mosaic law as preparations for freedom. Physical slavery thus began to acquire a new meaning in the history of human salvation. In the Hellenistic period, two of the most significant attempts to relate slavery to the progress of the human spirit were those of Philo and Dio Chrysostom, a wandering Greek sophist who was known for denouncing the immorality of cities, and for his idealization of the simple life of the herdsman of Euboea. Both philosophers endeavored to distinguish the truth from the literal meaning of slave. They agreed that men naturally love liberty and look on slavery as shameful and degrading. The difficulty was that ordinary men had no understanding of what the words really meant. Two lines of argument expose the ambiguities of common usage. What do we mean, asked Dio in the tantalizing spirit of all philosophers, when we say that a man is a slave? It cannot be a lack of freedom to act on his own judgment, for soldiers and sick men and members of choruses are not slaves. It cannot be that money has been paid for a man, since this is done in a ransom. It cannot be a negation of all personal benefit, since wise masters will always look out for the well-being of their property. It cannot be dependence upon another for one's life, since pirates and judges may execute those who come within their power. And is it not possible, Philo asked, for a man to be a slave to vices and passions, to the fear of death, or to the opinions of the multitude? After showing the difficulties in arriving at a satisfactory definition, both philosophers used the traditional Stoic argument that slavery of the body is the result of mere chance and convention. Since this condition had no basis in objective nature, Philo concluded that it was not a proper subject for philosophy. The implication being that the vicissitudes of fortune could not raise moral issues. Apparently, Dio would have agreed with this judgment, but in order to show that true slavery and freedom had nothing to do with external conditions, he went on to undermine the entire legal basis of the institution. Prisoners of war, he said, could not be true slaves, held only by force. There was no reason why, if given the power, they should not escape or retaliate by capturing their former masters. If this was true, masters had no better title to the descendants of captives. Quote, consequently, if this method of gaining possession, from which all the others take their beginning, is not just, it is likely that no other one is either, and that the term slave does not in reality correspond to the truth. This argument would seem to come close to the position of later abolitionists who held that slavery had no legal basis whatsoever. The abolitionists would assume that if the term slave does not in reality correspond to the truth, then free-born men were being subjected to an oppressive environment and would in all justice be released from illegal coercion. Dio Chrysostom, however, lived in a different intellectual world, and the fact that physical slavery lacked any legitimate basis suggested to him only that one must look beyond literal meanings to understand the true nature of slavery and freedom. He utterly rejected, of course, the Aristotelian distinction between Greek and barbarian, and pointed out that any race would have countless ancestors who were both slaves and freemen. Yet in some sense, he and Philo simply reframed the Aristotelian distinction on Stoic principles. The true slave was a man ignorant of what was allowed and forbidden by natural law. A great king might be a slave, a man in bonds a free man. For Philo and Dio Chrysostom, this was not figurative language, but a statement of reality. If a man found himself called a slave and treated like one, this was a matter of no importance as long as he possessed the freedom of all virtuous men to rise above material conditions. Every good man was free, but, quote, he who with a mean and slavish spirit puts his hand to mean and slavish actions contrary to his own proper judgment is a slave indeed, end quote. Philo said he agreed with Zeno that a true slave had no right to speak to a good man as an equal. The slave was, in short, a sinner. And despite his indifference to social condition, Philo slipped back into the significant inconsistency of identifying spiritual with physical slavery. To show that good men love freedom and detest slaves, he cited the examples of Athenians excluding bondsmen from the celebrations of the venerable goddesses and of the Argonauts barring slaves from their crew. Apparently forgetting his distinction between true and apparent slaves, he wrote, quote, "We may well deride the folly of those who think that when they are released from the ownership of their masters they become free. Servants indeed they are no longer now that they have been dismissed, but slaves they are, and of the vilest kind, not to men, which would not be so grievous, but to the least reputable of inanimate things, to strong drink, to potherbs, to baked meats. Thus Diogenes the Cynic, seeing one of the so-called freedmen pluming himself, while many heartily congratulated him, marveled at the absence of reason and discernment. A man might as well, he said, proclaim that one of his servants became from this day a grammarian, a geometrician, or musician, when he has no idea whatever of the art. For as the proclamation cannot make them men of knowledge, so neither can it make them free, for that is a state of blessedness." End quote. I think this is going to be about 90 pages, or page 90. Yeah, it's exactly page 90. So we're on page 81. We got a ways to go. Philo did not see that a man released from physical bondage might have a greater chance of acquiring spiritual freedom. Environment, he believed, had no bearing on morality, yet he still thought of the slavish character as that exhibited by physical slaves, and this was a defect that no deed of manumism could remedy. But when Philo had given examples of groups of men dedicated to a life of virtue, such as the Persian Magi and the Indian gymnosophists, he had allowed himself a long digression on the Essenes of Palestinian Syria. There is no evidence that he had first-hand knowledge of the Essenes, and his picture of them bears a resemblance in tone to the idealization of American Quakers by French philosophers. He presented these athletes of virtue, quote unquote, as proof of the possibility of a life of true freedom and perfection, refraining from any association with war or weapons, or from any employment that stimulated vice. They led a frugal and simple existence, sharing houses and property, providing for the sick and aged, and contributing their earnings to a common fund. Moreover, not a single, and this is another quote, "Not a single slave is to be found among them, but all are free, exchanging services with each other," and he denounced the owners of slaves, not merely for their injustice in outraging the law of equality, but also for their impiety in annulling the statute of nature, who mother-like has borne and reared all men alike and created them genuine brothers, though this kinship has been put to confusion by the triumph of malignant covetousness, which has wrought estrangement instead of affinity and enmity instead of friendship. End quote. Although this passage is of obvious importance in the history of anti-slavery thought, it raises many problems. Josephus, the other principal source on the Essenes, was also trying to accommodate Judaism to Greek ideas, though he claimed to have lived for a while with the association. In the Jewish War, that's a title, he enumerated their distinctive practices. They avoided oaths, believed in the immortality of the soul, and sought to escape from the wantonness of women by leading celibate lives. They had suffered great persecution from the Romans, who had futilely tried to make them violate their principles. But while Josephus mentioned that new members gave their property to the order, he said nothing of slavery. Among the several references to the Essenes in his Jewish Antiquities, the only relevant one is a statement that they neither married nor were desirous to keep servants, since servants tempted men to be unjust. This scarcely confirms the strong anti-slavery attitude mentioned by Philo. The only certainty is that anti-slavery was part of Philo's idealized picture of the brotherhood. We should not need to stress that such an unqualified condemnation of slaveholding was unusual, even unprecedented in antiquity. It was associated, let us note, with a combination of three elements. First, the primitivistic ideal of liberating the individual from the corrupting influences of society. Second, the perfectionist ideal of working out in concrete terms the social meaning of moral freedom. And third, the expectation of an apocalyptic fulfillment and judgment of man in history. In a sense that they sought freedom from sin, from society, and from history as mere repetition, the Essenes anticipated the more radical sects of Protestantism, which were the first groups in the modern world to denounce the holding of slaves. We can only surmise that the Essenes and the Hebraic sense of place and promise gave a forward momentum to the Stoic belief that mankind was united through a common reason, unaffected by the accidents of time. According to the jurists Florentinus and Ulpian, 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 I'll say Ulpian. Slavery was a manifest departure from the jus natural, but was sanctioned by the jus gentium. It was the single instance, Ulpian said, of a conflict between the principles of nature and the common law of nations. This sense of tension, inherited from the Stoics, was passed on to the institutes of Justinian and thence to the jurisprudence of Western civilization. But if slavery was unknown to nature and yet was so universal as to be part of the jus gentium, how could one account for the degeneration? And if all good men were free and all bad men slaves, could the bad men become good and so escape their slavery? What would prevent the original causes of slavery from reducing them to their former bondage? These questions the Stoics raised, but could not answer. They associated true slavery with a kind of sin, but it was a sin that could be conquered only by man's inner resources. For Christians, Jesus gave the answer when he spoke to the Pharisees. Quote, "If ye abide in my word, then are ye truly my disciples, and ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free. They answered unto him, We are Abraham's seed, and have never yet been in bondage to any man. How sayest thou, Ye shall be made free? Jesus answered them, Verily, verily, I say unto you, every one that committeth sin is the bondservant, doulos, of sin, and the bondservant abideth not in the house forever, the Son abideth forever." End quote. At first sight, this passage resembles the Stoic paradox that true liberty can only can come only from an inner change in man's nature, that most men who think of themselves as free are really slaves. Yet Jesus preached a profounder conception of man's need for redemption from his slavery to sin. It may be objected, as the Pharisees might well have done, that the word slave was only figuratively applied to the sinner. But as early Christians repeatedly conceived of sin and salvation in terms of slavery and freedom, the words acquired complex layers of meaning that necessarily affected men's response to the institution of slavery. Thus, St. John Chrysostom, commenting on the above passage of Scripture in the 4th century, complained that many people would still prefer to be the slaves of sin rather than the slaves of men. And whereas Plato associated the disorder of the material world with slavery, and the Stoics thought of conventional society as irretrievably fallen, Paul spoke of all creation being delivered from the douleia of corruption into the liberty of the children of God. Both he and Jude referred to themselves as the slaves of Jesus Christ. And since no servant, oiketus, could have two masters, men were told that they must choose between God and mammon. The concept of slavery is further widened when we learn that the story of Abraham's sons was an allegory of Christ liberating mankind from bondage to Mosaic law. Ishmael, born of a slave mother, represented bondage to the flesh and to the old covenant of Sinai. Isaac, born of a free mother, represented the spiritual liberty of the future. Thus, quote, "We are, as Isaac was, children of promise." End quote. This meant that Christians had been called for a life of freedom, not of the flesh, but as willing slaves to one another. In the eyes of Christians, the independent natural man, idealized by primitivists in all ages, was a sinner who, lacking the essential capacity for virtue, bore a certain resemblance to Aristotle's natural law. Even Aristotle had implied that the natural slave, bereft though he was of the highest faculties, had at least the freedom to accept the gift of emancipation. So, under Christianity, the most hardened sinner could accept the gift of grace. In a rather extravagant analogy, Tertullian said that just as a slave girl who is espoused but not yet married, because not yet freed, should be excused if she committed adultery with another man, so a pagan who was a slave to sin, though pledged to Christ, would be forgiven for his sins. But freedom from the slavery of sin was not freedom from the principle of bondage. If the sinner was free from righteousness, the saint was the slave of righteousness. Perfect liberty, as theologians were long to maintain, lay in absolute conformity to God's will. The result, as Lecky acutely observed, was that Christianity gave a certain moral dignity to servitude. For the Romans, the servile character was synonymous with everything lowly and vicious. Christianity raised obedience, humility, patience, and resignation to the level of high virtues. Lecky concluded with perhaps too much zeal that Christianity inevitably equalized men, and thus led the way to the abolition of slavery. It is true that upon conversion, early Christians sometimes gave up their property and manumitted their slaves. As a priest, the ex-slave saw the greatest nobles kneeling humbly at his feet. The author of Ephesians said that God, no respecter of persons, was the master of masters as well as of slaves. But he also told slaves to be obedient, quote, "unto them that according to the flesh are your masters, with fear and trembling in a singleness of your heart as unto Christ." End quote. We thus come to a fundamental duality in the New Testament. As men gathered to prepare for the imminent kingdom, temporal distinctions were of little importance. Christ's message was universal. All men were brothers in union with God. But for this very reason, if a man was called to be a slave, he should not try to become free. Quote, "For he that was called in the Lord, being a bondservant, is the Lord's free man. Likewise, he that was called being free is Christ's bondservant." End quote. In the blinding light of the gospel message, men could both accept and disregard social distinctions. It is only with this attitude in mind that we can understand the meaning of Paul's epistle to Philemon, which aroused such wearisome debates during the slavery controversies of the 18th and 19th centuries, because the letter pertained to the relations of a particular master and a particular runaway slave, and because the circumstances of the case can only be inferred, we must not read too much into the text. Paul himself drew no general propositions. He simply exhorted Philemon to take back Onesimus, whom Paul had converted to Christianity, quote, "no longer as a servant, but more than a servant, a brother beloved specially to me." End quote. The letter would seem to prove no more than that early Christians were allowed to hold even fellow Christians as slaves, though they were urged to treat such bondsmen more as spiritual brethren. In the 4th century, St. Basil saw in the epistle no implication that Christian slaves should be freed. On the contrary, Paul had set a precedent for admonishing and returning fugitives to their masters. Even if masters tried to force slaves to break the laws of Christ, there was no excuse for flight. We may assume that the early Christian attitude toward slavery was summarized by Ignatius, Bishop of Antioch, in his epistle to Polycarp. Quote, despise not men or women slaves, yet let them not be puffed up, but rather bear their slavery for the glory of God, that they may win from him thereby a better liberty. Let them not seek to be emancipated at the expense of the common fund, that they may not be found the slaves of desire. End quote. Theologians, it is true, continued to insist on a theoretical distinction between spiritual and physical slaves. Like the earlier Stoics, St. Ambrose and Ambrosiaster maintained that a slave may in reality be freer than his master. Augustine agreed with Philo of Alexandria that good men were free and evil men slaves, irrespective of their stations in life. Masters were often charged with the sins of pride and sensuality. Clement of Alexandria saw a connection between slavery and sexual perversion. Gregory of Nyssa accused the arrogant slave owner of condemning a man who by nature was free, and thus of setting himself up in rivalry to God. But since the entire drama of sin and salvation was conceived as a spiritual analogy to slavery and emancipation, even to the point of imagining sin as an inherited but deserved defect that one could not escape on his own volition, it was only natural that physical slavery should be increasingly seen as the consequence of sin. Saint Ambrose, Saint Isidore of Seville, and especially Saint Augustine thought of slavery, along with all secular instruments of coercion and government, as part of the punishment for man's fall from grace. They recognized, as had Aristotle and the Stoics, that the chances of fortune did not always correspond to the inner condition of an individual's soul. It was inconceivable, however, that injustice should darken God's omnipotent rule of the world. According to Augustine, slavery was a remedy as well as a penalty for sin, and it was God who bore the direct responsibility for appointing both masters and slaves. Though man had originally been free and had been given dominion over only the beasts, his presumptuous violation of the natural order had made bondage a necessary check on the excesses of his own evil will. Thus, as Plato had intimated, slavery was part of the grand scheme of divine order and government, a disciplining force restraining subterranean currents of evil and rebellion. If it were objected that military victories were sometimes won by wicked men who enslaved their innocent victims, Augustine's reply was that no men were innocent. Even such an apparent injustice should be seen as a divine judgment. All slaves thus deserved to be slaves, and their only comfort might be in the thought that if they served with faithful affection, they might at least make their bondage in some sense free. The only true slave, after all, was a slave to sin. The Christian household should be a sanctuary for the cultivation of piety and discipline. The paterfamilias was enjoined to treat his dependents with charity, but he was also obliged to enforce the domestic peace. As Christians looked less to an imminent millennium and more to the need of accommodating themselves to the world, they tended to accept the institutions of state and society as a necessary framework for controlling sin and allowing the church to perform its sacramental functions. Slavery was increasingly justified under what Ernst Troeltsch has termed das relative Naturrecht, which was a natural law adapted and modified for sinful man. The Church not only accepted the institution, but made every effort to ensure the security of masters in controlling their property. Thus, the canons of the Church reinforced civil law in protecting owners against the loss of slaves to the Church. No slave could be ordained unless he had first been emancipated. The fathers exhorted slaves to obey even the harshest masters, and in AD 362 the Council of Gangray laid anathema on, quote, anyone who under the pretense of godliness should teach a slave to despise his master or to withdraw himself from his service. On the other hand, the Church embodied the principle that all men are equal, not as a positive right, but as the dependent children of God. It upheld the ideal of a spiritual world in which all men might be free. We cannot discuss here the complex question of Christianity's role in ameliorating the condition of European slaves. Despite the Church's unquestioning acceptance of slavery as an institution made necessary by original sin, there can be little doubt that it often lightened the burden of the individual slave. But if Christians preached religious equality and expected pious masters to be kind to their slaves, the same would later be true of the Muslims. In neither instance is there any reason to believe that religious belief promoted the outright abolition of slavery. The fact that Christians accepted the institution until the 18th century without marked protest suggests a high degree of tolerance. Many historians have exaggerated the antithesis between slavery and Christian doctrine. The contradiction, as we have tried to show, lay more within the idea of slavery itself. Christianity provided one way of responding to this contradiction, and contained both rationalizations for slavery and ideals that were potentially abolitionist. The significant point, however, is that attitudes toward slavery were interwoven with central religious concepts. The amalgam which had developed through antiquity was foreshadowed in Judaism and Greek philosophy. In one sense, slavery was seen as a punishment resulting from sin or from the natural defect of soul that precluded virtuous conduct. The slave was a Canaanite, a man devoid of logos, or a sinner who scorned the truth. Stoics and Christians endeavored to distinguish the true from the apparent slave, but physical bondage always suffered from the guilt of association. In a second sense, slavery was seen as a model of dependence and self-surrender. For Plato, Aristotle, and Augustine, this meant that it was a necessary part of a world that required moral order and discipline. It was the base on which rested an intricate and hierarchical pattern of authority. Yet Jews called themselves the slaves of Yahweh. Christians called themselves the slaves of Christ. No other words so well expressed an ultimate in willing devotion and self-sacrifice. In a third sense, slavery stood at the starting point for a divine quest. It was from slavery that Hebrews were delivered and from which they acquired their unique mission. It was slavery to desire and social convention that cynics and stoics sought to overcome by self-discipline and indifference to the world. And it was from slavery to the corrupted flesh of Adam that Christ redeemed mankind. For some 2,000 years, men thought of sin as a kind of slavery. One day they would come to think of slavery as sin. And that is the end of that chapter. Wow. All right. Wow. That was another very good chapter. Lots to think about. Um, I don't know. That's all I have to really say about it. I'm really enjoying this book. Um, It's been great so far. We've got, I think, 15 chapters and an epilogue, so we'll see. There's no way I can do more than one chapter a night on this, though. So, anyway, that'll be that for this session. I am going to end it and um, play a little bit of Oblivion. So, I will be back shortly in the next session. I will see you then.